Well, good evening. My name is Rob Woolsey. I'm a member of the Guild of Battlefield Guides. And tonight I'm going to be talking about two of my favorite new battles that I like to go to and see and visit. And they are Operation Totalize and Tractable. And if you've never heard of these two battles, that's not a big surprise. They're the later end of the Normandy Campaign from 1944. And they are battles that are sometimes considered controversial and are not well known because they aren't Canada's most spectacular and stunning successes, but they were victories. So MFS Family Services Europe is not affiliated with any of the companies, apps, or products named in this presentation. They don't endorse or anything like that. These are things that I use or I recommend from my experience as a battlefield guide all over Europe. So we're going to give a quick battle overview, which I'm doing right now. We're going to talk about recommended preparations for this trip. Normandy is an interesting place, but you do have to be prepared. Some travel advisories and visas, some helpful hints, some must-try food and treats. The food in Normandy is spectacular. Anything apple-based is to die for. Some places to stay, really important, because the battlefield is actually bigger than people realize, and it's not just about the beaches. Some transportation challenges, because we are in rural France. I'm going to talk quickly about the Normandy campaign from July to August. Everybody knows about the June battles because everybody knows about D-Day. This is the harder and more messy part of the battles. Then I'll talk about Operation Totalize, which took place from the 7th to the 10th of August, 1944. And then I'm going to talk about Operation Tractable, which took place from the 14th to the 21st of August, 1944. And I'll talk about a couple things that are just worth mentioning. So behind in the photo in this one, that's the ruins of Falaise post the Canadians liberating it. One of the things that people fail to realize or understand is that the French paid a terrible price for their liberation because we were fighting in their back door and we hit them when nobody was expecting it, and the battlefield was full of civilians. So we're talking about France, and we're talking about Normandy, and specifically the Calvados region. Its population is about 107,000 people. They speak French. The closest main international airport is Paris Charles de Gaulle, and the closest regional one is Caen-Carpiquet Airfield, which was the scene of a fairly famous battle, Operation Windsor, in the beginning of July 1944. Quick background. This area is the home of William the Conqueror, and it's the main objective for a series of British and Canadian attacks from the middle of July to the end of August 1944. And it then took 10 years to clear the debris and war remains from this area. It was absolutely littered with destruction. And so it took a lot to clean it up. France is the 10th most expensive country in the world. So it's higher than the average. And a cool fact is, William the Conqueror was actually born at the Chateau de Falaise in 1027, and it is the oldest castle fortress in all of Normandy. And it is so cool to see. So that's the fortress there. Normandy, it's generally quite a mild climate with wet, cool winters and warm, dry summers. The best time to travel there is really the end of April till about the middle of November. I was there at the beginning of November. It was wet and cold, and they decided to have a big storm, but it's still absolutely travelable. Always bring a rain jacket. It's a great idea. It's near the coast. It will rain. And of course, the farther inland you move, it's going up. So that's a challenge. It helps break the wind as well. Always have good footwear. Some of the sites you can see and go to, you will definitely need it. It'll be fields and some trails and some tracks, and footing isn't always great. Always have medical and travel insurance. It's always a great idea. You never know what can go wrong. All the memorials in most places in this area are very child-friendly. There are city passes available for actually Falaise and Caen. They are two different cities, and they have city passes for both. So travel advisories for France, always check them beforehand, especially with the Olympics coming up. All restrictions for COVID have been lifted. There's no visa requirements from EU countries, but the max stay if you're coming from Canada is 90 days. So petty crime is generally a risk, but generally Normandy is really quite safe, but France writ large is at risk of terrorism. Medical care, there's a hospital in Falaise and in Caen. 112 is the emergency number. And the embassy is in Paris, and it's the only embassy or consulate in all of France. So some helpful tips. Always dress for the weather. It's close to the sea. It can get chilly really quickly. It can turn on you. So always be kind of prepared for that. Please don't climb on any of the monuments. That's exactly what they are. Especially they are monuments. Many of them will have ashes spread around them, or they'll be consecrated. So that's really important. Or they will be also in pretty poor shape. So that bottom picture is a Tiger tank. It got moved out of the way by the Black Watch of the 2nd Canadian Division. It's been outside for 80 years. It's not in the greatest condition. So you don't climb on it. You don't know what's going to happen. It might be in worse shape than you realize. And it's also a tribute to these people. This is their home. This is where they live. These are part of their community and their villages. So remember when we're there, when you're visiting, respect the property memorials and people's businesses and things like that, because that's how we get to go back time and again. So the food in Normandy, I'm surprised I don't gain 100 pounds. So the escalope de Normand is veal escalope covered with fresh cream and mushrooms. It is delicious. I had it in November. I wanted seconds. But then there was dessert, which is the Terrigoule, probably the oldest in the region. It's sweet and it's a bit like rice pudding. It's quite tasty. The cider in France is incredible. It was the drink of the rich man. Beer was for poor people. It is great. It is just absolutely died for. Super fresh. Every town has its own version of it. It's just amazing. And of course, they have a liquor called Calvados, which is basically a stronger version of the cider. It's a digestive, and it's good. But troops love the Calvados because, of course, it was strong. It was available in vast quantities, and you'll often hear references to that from both British and Canadian and American soldiers from the war. So there are two places you can stay to do this, to see these locations. You can stay in Caen. If you're staying in Caen, there's an Novotel, Côte de Nacre. Highly recommend it. It's the one I use when I go do the beaches tours. It's a good base. Caen's got a lot of stuff. There are lots of hotels in and around Caen. You have some options, but that one has a swimming pool, has breakfast, has a restaurant that's open for dinner, very clean rooms, excellent service, and lots of parking. If you want to be closer to where you're actually going to be, so you have less drive up and down the Falaise-Caen highway, there's the Ibis Falaise Coeur de Normandie, which is quite nice. There's also Les Prémontés and La Maison Bouy Hotel. Again, smaller hotels, smaller area. You can still walk to many places inside those areas and you get a better feel for what was going on there. So those are all kind of recommendations, but there's also bed and breakfast. So you can choose to stay in the area in smaller little chateau type places that you can find as well. Anywhere in this region is really quite spectacular, but it does create transport challenges because, of course, getting around, you will need a vehicle. And saying that, there's only traditional taxis in and around the Falaise area, but there is rideshare in Caen. There's also a bus service from Caen to Falaise. If you're traveling between the two, but then getting around to the sites, you'll need a vehicle to get around. So why we always recommend tour guides. There are many around. Some are local, some are British, some are Canadian. A good place to find them is the Guild of Battlefield Guides website or Woolsey's War Walk, which is me. And I specialize in Canadian battlefield tours. And I do research on the people. And if you have family members that fought, we make that part of the tour. It also gets you around to some of these pretty crazy spots because some of them are really small out of the way, and you wouldn't know they existed unless you have a guide, and then they give you the context of the battle, because going to a memorial is great. If you don't know which way you're looking, it makes it hard to understand. So let's talk about the Normandy campaign first to get to these situated. So there's Operation Windsor, Operation Charnwood, Operation Atlantic, and Operation Spring. These are 4 big operations in the month of July, and they inflict tons of casualties. So the Canadian Army in Normandy by July of 1944 had grown in size significantly with the addition of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division and the activation of the 2nd Canadian Corps. The first action of July 1944 was Operation Windsor from 4 to 5 July 1944, and that was the attack and capture of the Carpiquet airfield by the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division with support from the 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade, the same units that had landed on D-Day a month before. The success of this led to Operation Charnwood, which took place from the 8th to the 9th of July, which was a British-Canadian joint attack on the northern half of the city of Caen, which was also very successful. The 2nd Canadian Division had its first battle of the campaign in Operation Atlantic. the attack to clear the southern half of Caen and begin the drive towards Falaise. While the 5th Canadian Infantry Brigade of the 2nd Division was successful at forcing the Oron River crossing and taking half of the city southern half, the 4th and 6th Brigades, which were tasked to follow on from the 5th success, ran right into a German defensive position strongly held on a thing called Verrières Ridge and suffered 1,946 casualties in this very short, sharp action. The next attempt by the 2nd Canadian Corps to drive towards Falaise was Operation Spring, and this was another attack by the 2nd Canadian and now joined in with the 3rd Canadian Infantry Divisions with support from the 2nd Armored Brigade to storm the Verrières Ridge yet again. In the end, it was almost a complete failure. The Black Watch was almost wiped out when they stormed the positions held by the 9th SS Panzer and the 272nd Infantry Divisions in front of the village of Fontenay-le-Marion, after being told they should be able to take it and losing their commanding officer. The Régiment de la Maisonneuve and the Calgary Highlanders had been tasked to capture May-sur-Oron. They weren't able to take it, and they weren't able to hold it and were pushed back. The Royal Regiment of Canada had been stopped by the 2nd Panzer Division at the other end of the ridge on its attempt to take the village of Rocquencourt, and the North Nova Scotia Highlanders had been repulsed at Tilly-la-Campagne. The only units that made their objective were the Fusiliers Mont-Royal, which captured a place called Trotyval Farm, and the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, which actually took the town of Verrières. And all of this cost another 1,600 casualties for the Canadians. The 1st Canadian Army headquarters arrived on the 23rd of July, taking control of the 2nd Canadian Corps and the British 1st Corps, or basically the eastern part of the Normandy beachhead. The 4th Canadian Armored Division also began landing in Normandy at the end of July 1944, joining the 2nd Canadian Corps, along with the Polish 1st Armored Division. The stage was now set for the next big battles of the Normandy Campaign. Operation Totalize. So the first photo is men of the 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade outside of the village of Hostomel, Haute-Mesnil, I pronounced it the British way, on the 10th of August, 1944. So that's partway through the battle, or at the end of the battle, actually, is really what it is. And then there's men of the Toronto Scottish, which is the heavy weapons battalion of the 2nd Canadian Division. And they are in a universal carrier at the beginning of the battle. So, and the other one's a map that's showing all the Canadian and British and Polish and moves of Operation Totalize. Lieutenant General Guy Simons, the commander of the 2nd Canadian Corps, realized something had to be done to break the strong defenses on Verrières Ridge, and so devised a plan that would use the firepower of the Royal Air Force, along with a new idea of transporting infantry in armored carriers. And they would drive down either side of the Caen-Falaise Road, which is now the N158 and D658, bypassing the frontline defenses, advancing on the village of Cransmizil, capturing the main anti-tank defenses in depth, and then the follow-on divisions would continue on the road down to Falaise. The west side of the road would have the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division with the 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade in support, and on the eastern side was going to be the 51st Highland Division of the British Army with the 33rd Armored Brigade. The 4th Canadian Infantry Brigade, which was made up of the Royal Regiment of Canada, the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, and the Essex Scottish Regiment, were mounted in something called a Priest Kangaroo, which was the conversion of the self-propelled artillery piece called the M7 Priest that had just been removed from service from the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, who had used it in the initial landings so that they didn't have to worry about having more vehicles come ashore. And they converted it into a troop carrier by removing the artillery cannon and all of its associated equipment and storage, and then putting armor over the opening. These would make a significant difference in reducing casualties in the upcoming attacks. On the evening of the 7th of August, the attacking units formed up into 6 columns, 4 vehicles wide, each made up of tanks, these new Priest Kangaroo armored personnel carriers, armored half-tracks carrying some more infantry, self-propelled anti-tank guns, often called M10s or Wolverines or Achilles, depending on which nickname it was given, and specialist armored fighting vehicles called AVREs or Armored Vehicle, Assault Vehicle Royal Engineer, and specialist Sherman Crab flail mine tanks. At 11 p.m. on the 7th, Royal Air Force Bomber Command began their bombardment of the German positions, and at 11:30, behind a barrage fired by over 400 guns, the armored columns began their advance, guided by artillery-fired markers or the light anti-aircraft regiments of the divisions, firing tracers down a fixed line of a fixed color so the troops knew which direction they needed to go. They also used spotlights aimed up at the sky to create an artificial moonlight by lighting up the clouds. The dust and the debris caused chaos. Mixed with vehicles driving into bomb craters made the advance slow, but by dawn, the 51st Highland Division were attacking their objective of Cranesmill, and the 2nd Canadian Division were held up a little bit on their right-hand side by heavy resistance. The Canadians on the very, very western part of this did not have any armored vehicles. They were doing it on foot. But by noon, on the 8th of August, they had taken all of Verrier's Ridge. The mounted units suffered significantly less casualties than their dismounted counterparts. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, which was one of the first units going in, suffered 1 killed and 14 wounded, while comparatively, the Cameron Highlanders of Canada, who attacked on dismounted, had 30 killed and 96 wounded, and both were attacking similar-sized objectives. And this helped the Canadians drive as far south as they did. The next objective was the town of Sintho, which is about 3.2 kilometers south of where they had broken into. But General Simons ordered a pause in order to move up artillery to support the next attack, bring up the fresh and untested 4th Canadian Armored Division, moving into its very first action, and the Polish Armored Division, who was going to replace the British divisions, and they were going to take over for the phase 2 of the operation. The Germans quickly went about reinforcing their lines around the village of Sintho with 2 groups of a mixed force of Tiger tanks, infantry, and assault guns made up from troops from the 12th SS Panzer Division, the infamous Hitler Youth, which they then used to counterattack the Canadians. And while it failed, it did put the Germans north of the actual bomb line for phase 2, thus being spared being heavily damaged and destroyed. What's interesting about this battle, it actually takes place near one of the cemeteries, which is Bretteville-sur-Lez Canadian War Cemetery, and which is not far from Gostomel, and that's actually not far. And the opposite side, actually on the British side, is where the infamous tank ace Michael Whitman was actually shot. His tank was destroyed because he was foolishly charging at a British armored unit dug in with 17-pounder anti-tank guns and 17-pounder Sherman tanks, and on his front, thinking he could run them over. And the Sherbrooke Fusiliers were sitting on the side of the highway behind a fence, and basically they destroyed one gunner destroyed 3 Tiger tanks in 12 minutes with 5 shots. So yeah, their attack went really badly, and yeah, it was pretty spectacular destruction in that case. But this time it's a daylight bombing, and instead of being the Royal Air Force, it's the U.S. 8th Air Force, and they started dropping some bombs. Unfortunately, they made some mistakes in their bombing, and some of them dropped their bombs on the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, who were forming up in a support wave, killing 65 and wounding 150 Canadians. That's the 3rd Canadian Division commander was killed. A whole slew of troops were wounded. It was a really big mess. The Germans were able to slow down and then stop the advance. The infantry at Sintho had held up the units of the brand new 4th Canadian Armored Brigade and the regiments that did not press their attacks like General Simons had wanted. In fact, they pulled back as it got dark, as was armored doctrine at the time, and waited to attack the next morning. To get the attack moving again, General Simons ordered Major General George Kitching, the 4th Canadian Division commander, to send a force to capture a place called Point 195. It's a hill just west of the Falaise Road, halfway between Sintho and Falaise. The British Columbia Regiment, with infantry from the Algonquin Regiment of the 10th Canadian Infantry Brigade, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Don Worthington, advanced with 52 tanks and 2 companies of infantry, so about 250, 280 infantrymen, down the Falaise Road, when they bumped into the Canadian Grenadier Guards, who had began their attack to take the town of Bretteville-le-Rabet. And they decided to move around it because the commander had said he wanted to keep the element of surprise. But unfortunately, they drifted off course and ended up at a place called Point 140. about 6 kilometers east of where they were supposed to be and right in the middle of the German lines, which caused the Germans, of course, to panic because all of a sudden there is an armored regiment with most of a battalion of infantry sitting right in the middle of their positions. This force, called Worthington Force, named after Don Worthington, fought all day with absolutely minimal support. They reported themselves by radio 1.195, and no one thought to look anywhere else when they were calling in artillery and nobody was seeing the shells and nobody could find them. It was a bit of a chaos. And by that evening, Colonel Worthington was killed by a mortar shell on his position. Lieutenant Colonel Hay, who was the commanding officer of the Algonquin Regiment, was wounded. He lost his leg and died in 1949 from his wounds. And the 2 units were all but destroyed. The 2 companies that did not engage in the battle survived, as did one of the tank squadrons that did not engage. The 10th of August, it cost them 44 tanks, and almost everybody was killed or captured. The 10th of August had the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders perform a textbook night attack on point 195 to capture it because it was such an important objective, but not before the Germans were able to withdraw behind the River Laison, ending the actual operation. While Operation Totalize had been a complete success in its opening stages, its latter were marked by poor handling and blunders of inexperienced commanders. The casualties for Operation Totalize were 1,256 soldiers and 146 tanks. It also meant that another deliberate operation would have to be used to get to Falaise. So, the top picture is members of the Lake Superior Regiment, now the Lake Superior Scottish Regiment, just outside of Sintho after taking it. That's one of them in their universal carriers. The picture to the right is a member of the Fusiliers Mont-Royal, and that's walking through May-sur-Orne. It took 3 attacks to take that town, and as you can tell, it's pretty smashed. The bottom left-hand photo is the 4th Canadian. That's the Essex Scottish Regiment in their Kangaroo carriers, the Priest self-propelled carriers. And the other one is the tanks of the 4th Canadian Armory Brigade moving to near Sintho. So as you can tell, they're moving down what is, at the time, the Caen-Falaise Highway. It looks a little bit different today. That road still kind of exists, but it's now a 4-lane big highway. But this is kind of the battlefield. It's very open, not a lot of cover, and the Germans are on the high ground because we're, of course, advancing still up away from the ocean. So what can you see? Well, some of the places you can visit are the Point 67 Memorial, which is the end location for Operation Atlantic, the start and end of Operation Spring, and you can view the start line and the beginning of Operation Totalize from here. There's a couple of great memorials. It's the center photo here. And you can also see Trottyville Farm and a couple of other positions, May-sur-Orne, almost all the way to Fontenay. As well, there's also memorials to the Fusiliers Mont-Royal at Trottyville Farm and at Saint-Martin. There's memorials also in Fontenay-le-Marion to the South Saskatchewan. There's memorials to the Black Watch at Castin-en-Pine and in Saint-André and Saint-Martin. So there's little ones. They're hard to get to, but they still exist. And they all speak to those actions. There's also one in the town of Ifs, which was the support position. So the Bretteville-sur-Lys Canadian War Cemetery is a must-stop, as it is the end of Phase 1 for Operation Totalize and the start of Phase 2. And it's not far from that tank battle where the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, the 1st Nottinghamshire Yeomanry, and the 106th Panzer Battalion duked it out, and there was a whole slew of Tiger tanks killed. There are 2,793 Canadians, of which 91 are unknowns, commemorated in here, including 79 members of the Royal Canadian Air Force, because, of course, they were flying fighter, bomber, and fighter missions over top, as well as heavy bombers from 429 participated. Notable people here are Lieutenant Colonel Don Worthington, who, along with his brother Major John Worthington, both of the British Columbia Regiment, are buried side by side. Don Worthington was killed on the 9th of August, and his brother was killed at the beginning of Operation Totalize when a Allied Typhoon fighter bomber opened up on his position, and he got hit in the throat. Quite a significant thing. And one of the most important places, and that's so that's me on the .67 memorial down below teaching some of the guides. To my immediate left, or to the right of the photo is one of the more senior guides. He's actually the other Canadian expert in the guild. He's really good with Canadian stuff. And then there's me at the Worthington Force Memorial. So it's just in front of where the action took place. So if you see me in that photo by one of the granite markers, about 400 meters behind me or 300 meters behind me is actually where the tank battle took place. Formed a big square and they duked it out. The tanks actually stayed there till almost 1947. That's how long it took to clear them. There's also a memorial. So that memorial here is to the British Columbia Regiment as well as the Algonquins. And then there's also a memorial. It's currently under renovation at point 195, the actual objective of Worthington Force, and you can get there. And there's also a Polish War Cemetery if you're interested in visiting that. So Operation Tractable, and this is the map of Operation Tractable. And if it looks really confused, it was. So Operation Tractable and closing the Falaise Gap are two operations that kind of merged into one because one flowed into the other. And it's a significantly brutal fight. And unfortunately, the plan was a bit of a washout. So Operation Tractable was the last major attack by the 1st Canadian Army in the Normandy Campaign. And its goal was to capture Falaise, Troon, and Chambois with the encirclement and trapping of the German armies in Normandy, and then destroy or capture them. Very, very ambitious. This would be a brutal, long-running battle involving the 4th Canadian and 1st Polish Armored Divisions against the 12th SS Panzer Division, which also included the remains of 2 destroyed infantry divisions, and later the bulk of all of the survivors of the German armies in Normandy. So the greatest concentration of armored divisions the Germans ever had was in Normandy, and they were going to become charging at the Canadians. Before it began, though, a Canadian officer had gotten himself lost, drove into German lines, and promptly got killed. Unfortunately, he was carrying a copy of the orders for Operation Tractable, so the Germans knew what was going to happen and where. So they had only had enough time to move about 500 men, 15 tanks, and about a dozen anti-tank guns into the path of the attackers. One other significant change was the makeup of the attacking forces. The Priest Kangaroos were used again, along with half-tracks and universal carriers, to carry the attacking infantry, but the 4th Canadian Armored Division had attached to it the 8th Canadian Infantry Brigade from the 3rd Infantry Division, and the 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade was attached to the 2nd Canadian Division, 3rd Canadian Division, giving each of the divisions 2 infantry brigades and 1 armored brigade. So the 8th and 9th Infantry Brigades were mounted in Kangaroos and armored half-tracks, and the 7th Brigade and the 10th Brigade were on foot, so traditionally how they were going to go. So they kind of merged the two together. At noon on the 14th of August, which is considered a beautiful summer day, according to the war diaries, 800 heavy bombers, Lancasters and Halifaxes, hit the German positions, and like Operation Totalize, some dropped their bombs short onto the Canadians and Polish troops, inflicting them another 400 casualties on them before the battle even began. The artillery bombardment began, and the tanks and armored carriers started moving forward, creating dust like had never been seen before. Mixed with a smokescreen and the Germans creating smoke to cause some chaos, it was not enough to prevent the German defenders from taking a terrible toll on the attacking units, killing the commander of the 4th Canadian Armored Brigade, Brigadier E.L. Booth, and destroying his tactical headquarters in an ambush. This setback was compounded because the man appointed as his temporary replacement, the commanding officer of the Governor General's Foot Guards, also was wounded at the same time. He'd broken his leg in a mine strike and was trying to command the brigade without much success, in a great deal of pain, and with none of the vehicles required. Until he was evacuated the next day, when the commanding officer of the Canadian Grenadier Guards took over and had a headquarters quickly rebuilt with whatever vehicles they had. This causes some problems because it took until the 19th of August, so from the 14th to the 19th, it was 5 days, before Brigadier Monsell was finally released from the 2nd Canadian Corps. Kitching, the division commander, had been asking for him right after Booth had been killed, and it took General Simons 5 days to finally appoint him to take command. The armored personnel carriers proved their worth yet again, and as they were able to get onto the infantry, were able to get onto their objectives with minimal casualties, along with the newly introduced WASP vehicles, which were universal carriers mounted with flamethrowers, which are utterly terrifying little weapons. And they were able to clean out the defenders. But the River Laison proved to be a difficult obstacle for tanks and other vehicles to cross, and a traffic jam began until the engineers could come forward to bridge it. By late afternoon, the tanks had started creating their own crossing points or finding ways across because they were tired of being held up. And the advance continued once the engineers threw bridges across, and was considered very successful, even with the bombing of Canadians again by the RAF. This was later investigated, and it turned out that the RAF crews had made a mistake in their plotting, and they didn't do what they're supposed to and didn't follow their protocols, and they dropped bombs on the attacking troops and inflicted another 600 casualties by friendly fire. The 15th of August had the 2nd and 3rd Canadian Divisions pushing towards the city of Falaise, but the 4th Canadian Armored Division had made little progress in tough fighting towards the village of Troon. The 16th of August had the 2nd Division took Falaise finally, with a minimal struggle from the defenders, and it took 2 more days, though, to clear the entire town of stragglers. But this was the first major objective taken. The 2nd Corps then turned its attention to capturing Troon and trying to close the gap with the American forces, which had advanced at this point to the city of Argentan. By early afternoon on the 17th of August, the Polish Armored Division had outflanked 12th SS Panzer Division, cutting off Troon and establishing it at 3 points on high ground around it, allowing the 4th Canadian Divisions to drive to Troon, which it struggled to do, with some units being successful and others not so much. But by the morning of the 18th, they'd finally captured the town, and the Poles moved on and established themselves north of Chambois. This development triggered the Germans to keep fighting because they realized that the gap was now starting to close and they needed to open it and keep it open so units could escape. The 19th of August, the 2nd and 3rd Canadian Divisions were pushing against the northern side of the pocket, and the 4th Armored Division was still attacking towards Chambois. The Poles continued to move east and close the gap. It was also this day that American and Canadian forces linked up, and it was also when the Germans started their massive breakout attempt. The 20th of August had the Poles fighting for survival in the face of a German attack by 2 armored divisions, and the Canadians and Americans hit by a mixed force of armor and infantry, with some holes being opened, allowing some of the trapped Germans to escape. I'm going to stop there for a second because I'm going to talk through these photos, and then the next part of this battle is spectacular. So those are on the top left-hand photo, those are Canadians, infantry and tanks. It's 3rd Division guys moving towards the village of Falaise. They're trying to treat the wounded and get them clear as they're hard fighting. As you can tell, it's open spaces. Norman villages are walled a lot of the time, so it's a pretty tough fight. The other photo beside it is some Sherman tanks moving up between Herbert Foley and Totalize Campaign, getting ready to go into the attack. The bottom photo on the left is the Fort Garry Horse moving off near Bretteville-Rabet to begin their attack. As you can see, it's very, very open, not a lot of trees. And this is a lane just outside of Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives. It's a fort, actually. It looks a little bit different. The trees are much bigger now. And that is the catastrophe that fell upon the Germans, because the Canadians are sitting on the high ground shooting into this, and the Americans are coming up behind them. It's incredible. And you can still find shrapnel and bullets and metal bits all through this area to this day. So on the 20th, around midday, at the village of Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives, a mixed force of D Squadron of the South Alberta Regiment and B Company of the Argyll and Southern Highlanders, under the command of Major David Vivian Curry of the South Albertas, stormed the town, and after 6 hours had captured about half the town, cutting off a route out of the Falaise pocket. Over the next 36 hours, they held out against continuous attacks, never giving way. They were reinforced by 2 more infantry companies, D Company from the Argylls and B Company from the Lincoln and Welland, one of which marched right through the town, running into an ambush before falling back onto Curry's force. And in the end, Curry's force knocked out 7 tanks, 12 anti-tank guns, and inflicted 2,000 casualties on the German. Curry did not sleep for the entire time and was constantly in the fight for his actions, including taking out snipers, leading the toughest fighting, and calling down artillery on his position directly to stop the Germans coming at them. He was awarded Canada's only Victoria Cross for the fighting in Normandy. One of his actions was recorded on film and photo crew who happened to stumble into town partway through the battle. And that's what these photos are. So the top right photo is the closest actual live photo of a man winning the Victoria Cross. So the gentleman, he's got a helmet on and binoculars. He's got a pistol in his hand. That is Major David Vivian Curry. He's talking to a tank crewman whose tank had been blown up. That you can see part of the film crew recording it. The infantryman there is helping negotiate the surrender and round up the prisoners. This was about 100 guys led by an officer coming in on a motorcycle that they captured. And you can actually physically go to this spot today because that house in the background still exists. The top right is those troops then being marched away. David Curry's in the background again at St. Lambert-sur-Dives. As you can see, they're walking uphill. That's not actually far from where the memorial is today. And that post in the background of that top right photo is still there. On the bottom is some of the other prisoners being escorted by some of the Argylls away into captivity. The center one is a Sherman tank that was damaged in the taking of the town. It was quite significant. And then the other one is the other tank, is the first tank that was knocked out, actually taking the town the first time. The Germans have pushed hard against the Poles, inflicting terrible losses. About half the casualties suffered by the 1st Canadian Army in this battle were actually Polish troops, to the point where they were almost out of ammunition and completely out of supplies. The Germans were still leaking out from the pocket as the Canadians could not get to the Poles from all the resistance and lack of reserves. The 4th Division was exhausted. Night brought an end to the fighting, but the next day one last attempt to break out happened. But the Poles somehow held on, and an hour later the Canadian Grenadier Guards made it to them, finally closing the Falaise gap for good. And by that evening, most of the remaining Germans in the pocket had surrendered, ending the battle and the campaign. The cost was enormous. The Germans lost somewhere between 50 to 200,000 men in the Falaise pocket. It's not completely confirmed. There's lots of misinformation on that. They lost about 200 tanks, 1,000 artillery pieces, 5,000 other vehicles. In that same time, Canada suffered 5,500 casualties and the Poles 1,600. Operation Tractable has many sites you can actually visit. They include the Falaise Pocket Memorial in Chambois, the Falaise Memorial and Museum, and the Montreal Memorial and Museum. There are also some smaller memorials in Falaise and some of the other villages, but they are usually to units or they're small plaques. One interesting place I highly recommend you go visit is the village of St. Lambert-sur-Dives. And the reason you should see this one is there is a spectacular viewpoint put up there by the Canadian Battlefield Foundation. It's a vista point, and it overlooks a large part of this battle, the end of the battle of Operation Tractable in the Falaise pocket. You can literally see where the Germans were trying to pour across the Dives River and try to get out. And it also gives you a spectacular view of David Curry's battlefield because you can see almost everywhere he would have been operating. And it's also got some really great information on the battle and what happens around you. Driving into the town, there's a stone marker. It's the bottom right-hand photo commemorating David Curry and the forces that liberated town and his Victoria Cross actions. You can also walk into the town and identify the buildings from the period photos. You can even stand where he was in the famous photo, which I don't have the photo of me doing it, but I did. I posed like David Curry when I was there in November. And driving south of the town, you'll actually get to a little hamlet of Moisey. And the good to Moisey, do you remember that ford, the photo I told you was a ford south of the town? There was all those dead horses and all that. That's that exact same spot today. That photo was taken up a little bit higher up the road, but that's the ford crossing. And that to this day, you can still see damage and you can visit it there. It's actually pretty impressive. The Normandy campaign was a total of 57 days and ended officially with the liberation of Paris by the Americans on the 23rd of August, 1944. That's when Eisenhower declared that the battle was over. It was a bloody campaign, with the average loss per division per day being about 100 men. To give you a comparison of how brutal this battle was, the Battle of the Somme, which lasted 141 days, its loss rate was 89 men per division per day. So as much as we call Haig the Butcher, Montgomery had a really tough fight. And for the next few weeks, after this battle, these two battles, the Allies drove the retreating Germans all the way out of France and mostly out of Belgium. It was the furthest and fastest armored advance in history to that point. And it was done by the British Second Army. And it ended essentially at the Dutch border. And Dutch and German borders, when basically the Allies ran out of supplies because they still hadn't captured any ports. After this, the Canadians moved on and started liberating the Channel ports, and then got moved into the Scheldt estuary, where they spent the better part of 6 weeks fighting, trying to open up the port of Antwerp. Canada had fought hard and suffered significant losses in the campaign, leading to the 1944 conscription crisis, when the Canadian units were fighting at a much reduced strength in the fall. And in fact, most battalions were fighting at 2 and 3 companies at about 400 men because we didn't have conscription. I hope you enjoyed learning about Operation Totalize and Tractable. These are two of the biggest actions for armored warfare in Canadian history, and actually quite significant advances in battles. At the end of it, the commander of the 4th Canadian Armored Division, General Kitching, was fired because his units didn't perform as well as planned. Unfortunately, General Simons liked to lay the blame for his failures in planning and direction and ideas and his lack of experience onto some of his subunit commanders, and in fact blamed some of his battalion commanders for not being aggressive enough, which is an interesting fact for a man who had actually never led a unit in battle. Thank you very much.